want to welcome you all to the first Diversity and Justice Series speaker series presentation by Becky Pettit. She is the Barbara Bush Regents Professor of Liberal Arts and Graduate Advisor of Students in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. She received her bachelor's in sociology from UC Berkeley, go Bears, and her PhD in sociology from Princeton. Professor Pettit's research agenda lies at the intersection of criminology, demography, sociology, law and society, and social policy. Her research on mass incarceration, employment, wages, and the family has been published by the Russell Sage Foundation in the form of 2 books, and she's the author of numerous articles that have appeared in ASR, AJS, Demography, Social Problems, Social Forces, Law and Society Review, and others, to name a few. She has also served as editor of Social Problems and is on the editorial board, or has been on the editorial board of a number of the aforementioned journals. Dr. Pettit has also been the recipient of many honors and awards. She's the co-recipient of the James Short Paper Award from the American Sociological Association Crime, Law, and Deviance section, and has received a number of honorable mentions from the American Sociological Association's Law Section Article Prize Committee, as well as the Rosabeth Moss Cantor Award for Excellence in Work-Family Research. Her 2010, her co-authored book received a noteworthy book award in industrial relations and labor economics in 2010. Her work has been profiled nationally in a number of media outlets, and she has spoken at the White House, the Congressional Budget Office, the Department of Health and Human Services, and a number of other colleges and universities. Please help me in extending a warm anteater welcome to my long-term mentor, collaborator, and friend, Becky Pettit.
Thank you, Brian. And for those of you who are here this afternoon, I mean, I could hear that. You could just keep saying that. It's so sweet. So sweet. It's really great to be here. There are some people here. So when Brian asked me to come, I can't say no because I said this earlier, he makes me smarter. And I want to talk about some new work. And Brian actually hasn't even seen some of this. So I'm a little nervous. But also, there are some people here who've been incredibly influential in my career. And so I just wanted to say thank you to those people and how exciting it is for me to be here and at this time and talk about some new work. So thanks, and thanks for coming. I also want to say to the graduate students, this is not a job talk, okay? This is not a job talk. And I want to say this is not a model job talk, okay? Model job talks have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Hopefully we'll get to the end. They also have a question, it's situated in a literature, right? You've got theory and data methods, and then you have results and conclusions, and you tell us how it fits in relation to what we think we already know. I'm not sure I'm going to cover all of that. So I just want to be clear. This is a work in progress. It's very early. I am very eager for thoughts, suggestions, feedback, and but it is not a model. Not a model. Okay, and I have to say this because I always do, or have lately. I mean, it just orients the way I think about this. And so the working title of this paper, the front part is I'm committed to, the back it shifts day to day, but and it's really about illusions of justice and how we think this justice system works, and even for someone who studied various dimensions of the justice system for a long time, kind of what I read in the news and how that comports with my lived experience and my research. It doesn't always add up to me, and so this has been very powerful for me in thinking about this. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely about how I'm understanding legal fines and fees and related interactions with the criminal justice system in the state of Texas since about 2016. Okay, so I moved to Texas in 2014 from the University of Washington in Seattle, and at the time I was moving, Alexis Harris, a colleague and great friend of mine, was approached by the Arnold Foundation about doing a multi-state study of legal fines and fees. So she's done great work in the state of Washington. And so she said, oh yeah, I'm gonna reach out to friends and colleagues. So she reached out to me, new at Texas, and said, hey, do you wanna be involved in this project? And I said, oh yeah, sure. Because I've always been a great fan and supporter of her work. It's really important. And I thought there was not a chance at all that it would ever actually get funded. Not because I don't have a lot of enthusiasm and support for Alexis, but we're talking a massive project. And I also had absolutely no idea how big, complex Texas was. So I didn't know that it is as far from Austin to El Paso as it is from El Paso to Los Angeles. Now, turns out that $1,500 as a part of a travel budget to get to El Paso or thereabouts on a regular basis doesn't quite cover it. That's how much I didn't know. I was naive. So that's kind of how I came to this project. Everything I knew about legal fines and fees, I knew from Alexis. Everything I knew about Texas, I knew from either reading the newspaper or from a few visits to mostly Austin, which for those of you who've been to Texas, isn't necessarily like the rest of Texas. We'll talk about that more in a second. But in some ways, it's a lot like the rest of Texas. And so I've been trying to reconcile both what my angle to this whole project is and how to reconcile that with what I thought I knew, both about the criminal justice system and also about Texas. So when I started work on this project, one of the things I started to do, so this is 2014, 2015, and I went around to my colleagues at the University of Texas and elsewhere, University of Houston, other places in the state legislature, and said, what do I need to know? I'm engaging in this long-term project, studying legal fines and fees. It's multifaceted, multi-method. What do I need to know? And the first thing someone told me was, you need to know that people in Texas think criminal justice reform is over. We're done. Okay. And the second thing they said is that what you need to do is you need to understand you're not a Texan and you'll never be a Texan. But if you really want to talk to people, you need to get a nice pair of boots, a pair of jeans, and a pickup truck and just drive. Because then they'll start talking to you. So I still don't have a truck. And I'm working on the boots. So anyway, so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about sort of how we collectively, or how I thought people understood Texas as a model reform state. And then what I'm actually seeing on the ground, which may not be surprising to any of you. But I'm trying to figure out how to position it in relation to both the literature and also the policy debates. So I want to start with a quote from a former governor of Texas, Rick Perry. And this is something that's highlighted on the Brennan Center for Justice website about following the Texas model. And so among other things in this piece, he says, so in 2007, and this is a quote from his book, so in 2007, with broad support from Republicans and Democrats alike, Texas fundamentally changed its course on criminal justice. We focused on diverting people with drug addiction issues from entering prison in the first place and programs to keep them from returning. We expanded our commitment to drug courts that allow certain low-level offenders to stay out of prison if they agreed to comprehensive supervision, drug testing, and treatment. We added drug courts to more counties, increased funding, and expanded the types of crimes that allow a defendant to enter drug courts. Yat. We invested $241 million to create treatment and rehabilitation programs to address drug addiction and mental illness for people on probation and parole. And rather than immediate reincarceration for minor violations of parole or probation conditions, we introduced this system of progressively increasing punishments or, quote, graduated sanctions. And we provided more substance abuse programs in prisons or jails. A key shift was a focus on outcomes rather than volume. We offered financial incentives to local probation departments They would win additional state funds if they reduced the number of probationers returning to prison. Most departments accepted this challenge, and the number of new crimes committed by probationers substantially decreased across the state. These types of financial incentives are proven to work. Government should be funding what works, not blindly funneling money into broken prisons. And then he says the results have been remarkable. Okay, and he goes on to document what those are. Texas expanded the number of specialty courts. We reduced the number of parole revocations. We saved $2 billion. We saved lives. And we did this all while the crime rate dropped. Okay. It made us smart on crime. I'm really proud that in Texas, criminal justice policy is no longer driven solely by fear, but by a commitment to true justice and compassion for those shackled by the chains of addiction. So, here's a bunch of other headlines, some recent, some from 2014. So to read the news, talk with activists and advocates, and even among many of my colleagues, you'd be led to believe that Texas no longer deserves its historical reputation of being tough on crime or law and order. And to be sure, the number of people held in Texas state prisons has fallen in many jurisdictions, including, and some places, including San Antonio, have done incredible work humanizing the experience of interacting with some aspects of the system. And my new home state of Texas cut by 2/3 the number of children in juvenile justice facilities between 2007 and 2011. So it's against that backdrop that I started this work. It was 8 states, then 9 states, now 8 states, to study the experiences of with the criminal justice system with a focus on legal fines and fees. And even in this domain, apparently Texas has been called out as a model reform state. And so I want to share with you an email. So one of my collaborators, we kind of share all kinds of information. So one of my collaborators, Mary Patillo, who's doing work in the state of Illinois, sends me this email and says, "Hey, Becky, what do you think of this?" And it comes to her from an advocate who says in it, in terms of, this was just a few months ago, in terms of advocacy going forward, it may help to be able to point to Texas as one of the models for continued reform efforts in Illinois. And so there are 2 blurbs that are included in these promotional materials about why Texas is the model reform state. They both come from comments made by the Texas Supreme Court Chief Justice Nathan Hecht, who is on a federal advisory board on fines and fees, along with Alexis is on this board as well. And Hecht, he seems to be very much an advocate, and in his 2017 State of the Judiciary speech, he draws attention to legal fines and fees in the state of Texas. So the legislature recently passed SB, these are his words, and I quote, he's in his State of the Judiciary speech. He discussed legal fines and fees, and I quote, he said, "The legislature agreed and passed SB 1913, State Bill 1913. The bill makes statutory changes to improve the assessment and collection of criminal court costs by requiring judges to inquire about a defendant's ability to pay at the time of sentencing, and expanding tools judges can use if a defendant is unable to pay in full, including installment plans, community service, and a full or partial waiver of court costs. The bill also increases the minimum amount of credit for jail or community service from $50 to $100 per day, and prohibits the posting of a monetary bail in a fine-only offense, unless the defendant fails to appear and the judge finds that the defendant can post bail." End quote. He also later says, and this is another piece that's in this advocacy piece, which is, he says, quote, "Last year, Texas's 2,100 justices of the peace and municipal judges handled 7 million traffic, parking, and other minor offenses." So this is a model reform state, and there's 7 million minor cases being handled by judges. Most people just paid. Others were put on payment plans. Altogether, $1 billion was collected. Some defendants said they couldn't pay at all. Judges believed them in about 100,000 cases. In 640,000 cases, defendants went to jail. So, and then he basically says, that's a bad thing. They shouldn't go to jail. Okay. So that's what he said. Now, so that's, I mean, aspirational, I would absolutely agree. It's aspirational reform. Mary asked me, Mary said to me in the email, quote, I never get the sense from you that Texas should be the model on this, so I'd be curious to your reaction, end quote. So today basically what I want to do is sort of walk through why I'm a skeptic about Texas as a model reform state and how it is the data we have access to, the data we don't have access to, how they can inform sort of this question. Because I believe the judge wants to do the right thing. But I actually don't know on basis of what evidence, right, he's making some of his claims. And I think Rick Perry, in this particular instance, I want to believe him too, right? But when I see that 7 million cases are processed every year in the state of Texas, I find it hard to sort of get my head around it as a model reform state. Maybe it's better than it was, but I'm not sure that it's the model. So over 7 million cases, there are over 7 million cases that go through criminal courts in the state of Texas a year. Over $1 billion are collected in municipal justice of the peace and municipal courts in legal fines and fees. 30 to 70% of probation office budgets are covered by collections of fines and fees. So just to put some data on this, I don't know if everybody can read this, but so these are the 9 states. So this was from the very first. So we're in year 3 of this large-scale project, and we have a year 1 report which summarized the legal landscape in these 9 different states. And the year 2 report summarized some very basic information from people who were assessed legal fines and fees. Each state was to interview roughly 60 individuals who've been assessed legal fines and fees. So for those of you who don't know, Brian is doing this work in the state of California. I'm doing the work in Texas. Alexis Harris is in Washington. April Fernandez was in North Carolina. We're not doing North Carolina anymore. Karen Martin is in New York. Beth Hubner is in Missouri. Chris Eugen is in Minnesota. Mary Patillo is in Illinois. Sarah Shannon is in Georgia, and Brian Sykes is in California. And so when I read this rhetoric or hear this rhetoric about Texas reform, now this is not all the states, and this is just data that come from the BJS. But when I look at this, I have a hard time reconciling Texas as a model reform state. So in the state of Texas in 2014, there were close to 500,000 people on probation or parole. The community supervision rate was lower than in Georgia, but otherwise, and in Minnesota actually, but ranks pretty highly. The number of people in prison or jail at this time was the highest among any of these states, over 200,000 people. And in the incarceration rate was only lower than that in the state of Georgia, which is hardly viewed, I think, typically as a model reform state. So in looking at kind of where we're at now, just imagine you jump into Texas in 2014 and everybody says, oh, this is a model reform state. And I think, wow, it's pretty massive. And comparatively. And so I'm questioning how we've come to normalize, like what's become normal. And in my broader work, I think a lot about that in the context of reforms in the American criminal justice system that mean that now there are 2.2 million people in prison or jail, and at its height it was 2.3 million. and somehow that's massive progress. Okay, it's progress, but historically, comparatively, it's still on a scale that no one else is even close. And inequality within exposure is also pretty dramatic. And so in Texas, I'm trying to wrestle through some of those same things. One of the other things I want to point out, because it's really easy to critique others, and this is really like, it's also sort of just doesn't comport with my lived experience. So the first week I moved to Texas in 2014, I have a daughter who was 8, who's now 11, who was sick. And she gets sick a lot, sort of a chronic set of issues. And so we had to keep her home from school for 3 days. And we found a pediatrician, on the right track. Turns out she's sick at home again today. But that aside, I get a letter the very next week saying, your daughter has missed 3 consecutive days of school in the state of Texas. If she misses any more days of school, you are going to have to appear in adult criminal court. No, I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up, okay? I mean, yeah. And so, I'm like, what? I gotta go to court for my daughter? And it turns out truancy is a criminal offense in the state of Texas, and up until very recently could be punishable by up to $1,500, $500 to the child, $500 to each parent if there were 2 in the household, so it could be up to $1,500. And so here's the thing, when we talk about, when people were telling me about, Texas, there were egregious cases of juvenile abuse in the Texas juvenile justice system. The system declined by 2/3 in a very short window of time, 4 years. But during that same window of time, the number of children prosecuted in adult criminal court for truancy rose to, by 2014, 115,000 cases were filed in the state of Texas. And so 115,000 children and their parents had to appear in adult court in Texas. While again, since then, and since my initial observation, the legislature has enacted significant reforms. Children and their parents continue to face sanctions in adult criminal court for the sole reason of missing school. And this is something we actually observe in the courtroom. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I just want to, there's some great advocacy work that was done by Texas Appleseed and other places that drew attention to this to the legislature, and so there were reforms. Now, the impact of those reforms on the experience of the justice system, I think, is a little unclear. And certainly in the research that we've done so far suggests the picture that we're painting publicly is way more optimistic than. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know this. All right, so in the interest of sort of keeping some levity here, do you guys know what this references to? Okay, so if you haven't, we'll see how this technical stuff works. So I just want to show you the map of Texas according to the movie Bernie. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So every small town in Texas, and I like it a lot there. So don't get me wrong. But every small town in Texas thinks of themselves as totally different than every other small town in Texas. Every big town in Texas thinks of itself as totally different than every other big town in Texas. And they're all nice places. And there are nice people who live there. And collectively, it generates this massive criminal justice system that disproportionately houses and surveils Black and brown people. And it's not just about the surveillance, but also the monetary sanctions that have become, I think, a really critical piece of it and increasingly invisible. And so I want to just give you some examples about that as I frame this. So this is another figure that we constructed for that first year report, I believe, which is to sort of think about, much of Alexis's work focused on felony convictions in the state of Washington. And, so you've heard about Ferguson. That was not about felony convictions, right? These are often very low-level interactions with the police that can generate insurmountable fines and fees in different jurisdictions that reinforce and generate inequality. And so, just from, again, these existing data, incarceration represents in many ways just the tip of the iceberg. And, twice as many or more people are under supervision through probation and parole. And then, they're in the mid-decade of the teens, there are 27,000 traffic stops reported nationwide. I'm sorry, 27 million, sorry. Yeah, 27 million, thank you. And in these data that were reported, these are reported through the BJS. And, Texas, as I said, there's 7 million cases go through the courts every year. So Texas, it's a huge, huge system. And not every county or jurisdiction is the same, but everyone does this, right? Every jurisdiction assesses, collects legal fines and fees. And these are so this is a map that was put together by a graduate student of mine, Ilya Slavinsky, who's working on this project. And this map, there are 2 maps of Texas. Can you see this? So basically the darker shaded these are legal fines and fees per capita. And those are legal fines and fees. And these are collections. So I recognize, these are collections. So of that $1 billion in 2014, or over $1 billion, how were these distributed across the state? So there's not 5 regions of Texas, and there's not 1 region of Texas. There are 254 counties in the state of Texas, and there's variability in how those are assessed and collected. And one of the things that we're really trying to understand is what explains that. And yeah.
Does the O stand for obligations? Legal fines and obligations?
Legal financial obligations, yes.
And the variable is what they actually collected on those obligations?
That's right.
Okay, and then
That's right.
The gap is some variable as well.
The gap is some variable. And it turns out we've been looking at that assessments and collections, and these are just collections. Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, they tell us really different things. And some places are more efficient at collecting. And one of the things that the judge, so one of the things that the judge was talking about in his State of the Judiciary is the state has made a commitment to become more efficient. And localities are rewarded for being more efficient in their collection of legal fines and fees. And this has actually created a real tension because judges will say, well, what levers do I have to increase my efficiency? And they'll say, I can jail them, right? I can jail them. I can give them community service, which means I don't actually get any money, right? Or I can continue to surveil them in some way. And so judges have mixed feelings about this, but community, like the budgets from the state back to the communities have until very recently, and even still they're, as far as until I don't know exactly the implications of the most recent legislative session, but the sort of the pushback that goes back to the counties based on the collections is tied to how efficient they are. Okay, so these are collections. Okay, so in this large project, we do a bunch of things. We did this legal review. We did interviews with people involved in the criminal justice system, and then we did courtroom and related observations. Depending on what state you're focused on, different states did these in slightly different orders. And so I'm going to tell you about what we know so far about the people we interviewed, and then I want to tell you about some of the observations that I've done and and I think maybe I'm making a fallacy or like mistakes of a first-year graduate student. I don't know. I mean, no offense to the first-year graduate students, but I'm new. I'm new to ethnographic research, and I'm finding it fascinating, horrifying, and intellectually very generative. And so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the people that we've interviewed and how that's varied across states. These are all from a published report. But then I want to share some of the field work. And this is the This is the second year report title. It's available on this website, www.monetarysanctions.org. And I'm sorry if you can't see this, but so there's a bunch of tables in this report, and we have for those people we interviewed, so in the state of Texas, we interviewed 65 people who were assessed legal fines and fees. We focused on 3 primary jurisdictions, one in West Texas, one in East Texas, and one in Central Texas. We have observed in other places as well. And we asked a series of open-ended questions. We also asked a series of closed-ended questions. And we did this similarly across all these states. And so this just tells us a little bit about how much was assessed, were automatic payments deducted, did those automatic payments in their view affect their other bills, have they ever made payments toward their LFOs, their legal financial obligations, and how much did they pay? Maybe I should back up and say what legal financial obligations are. So the definition that we're sort of using for legal financial obligations, some people also call them monetary sanctions, are fines, fees, court costs, and other monetary sanctions that are assessed through the criminal justice system. This is actually a point of debate among our team itself, because for some people, they want to talk only about those assessed upon conviction. But I think for some of us, there's no conviction involved. There may never be a conviction, and yet people have very significant financial obligations to the state. And so they may have to actually pay court fees and costs to get a case dismissed. So there was a charge, there was a probationary sentence with the idea of a deferred adjudication, but in order to have that case closed or ultimately dismissed, they have to meet their monetary obligations. So it varies a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you include restitution in there? And do you also include, so you're also including felonies, right? So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so the sampling design was somewhat aspirational, somewhat realized. And the idea was that we were supposed to interview people with misdemeanors and felonies or charges. And we did ask about restitution. And in different states, that plays out really differently. And so where you see sometimes the numbers are really big, those are probably, like there was a case in Missouri, which is part of the reason we reported means and medians, because there was a case in Missouri where somebody had like $100,000 of restitution. And so we're paying attention to that, but I would say it affects a relatively small fraction of the people we've interviewed across states so far. Okay, so I just want to point out Texas here, and then the totals are just across. At this point, we had interviewed, I think, 380 people. We're now up to about 450. But at this point in Texas, we have, most people are, the amounts assessed are fairly low, from, 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 3,000. I mean, that captures many of our folks, and then there are a few that were assessed more. The 10,000 or more, that's a restitution. Those are restitution cases where somebody has a pretty sizable restitution order. Texas, it's not common for people to have automatic payments deducted from any source of income. Those who had payments deducted, they said it affected their ability to pay other bills. 2/3 of the people we interviewed said they were trying to pay, or they had paid. Now, they actually said they had made payments toward their LFOs, and the amount paid on average was $979. Some people paid a lot. The median was $275. So that's kind of what our sample looks like. And then demographically, we did the same. These are just really simple demographic tables. In Texas, we had a pretty equal distribution of whites, blacks, and Latinos. We interviewed, a third of people self-identified as Hispanic or Latinx. We interviewed a disproportionate number of men, maybe not surprising given contact with the criminal justice system, but these very low-level offenses, there are more women. I mean, we see a good number of women coming through the court, going to pay their fines and fees. And then many of the people we interviewed were relatively young, a few over age 40, not many. And then Education in the state of Texas, our modal category was some college, but 39% had less than or 16% had less than a high school diploma. Less than a quarter, just about a quarter, had high school graduate or GED. Very few in our sample were in school. Very few in our sample were married, although almost half, 45%, were reported supporting children. In our sample in Texas, 51% reported being employed. This is any kind of employment. This is a very expansive kind of employment, way of thinking about employment. Just over a third were unemployed but looking for work. 14% were unemployed and not looking for work. Their household income, so I don't know what y'all make here at the University of California, Irvine, but in Texas, 5% of our sample made $5,000. This is household monthly income. Income from all sources, all people in the household. 5%, which is like one person, made more than $5,000 a month. Times 12, that's $60,000 a year. So I had one person who made over $60,000 a year in my whole sample. And then, it's distributed in other places. And, and there's some variability across states. There's some differences and some similarities. In Texas, we had a third of the people we interviewed were on public assistance. I almost left this off for your benefit because Brian, this has been so we're learning a lot in this multi-state study. and so in some cases, the data weren't properly recorded. I mean, that's not Brian's fault. There's an interface issue. And so, all of this, it's all available, publicly available in our report. The data will eventually be publicly available. But this is just kind of a snapshot. I mean, these are the folks we interviewed. And here in Texas, this is their legal characteristics. So in Texas, only 31% of the people we interviewed were ever convicted of a felony. Now that's where we see a lot of variability across the states. In Washington, everybody they interviewed was convicted of a felony at some point. Not necessarily that interaction, but at some point. But so for us, 75%, and these are not mutually exclusive, but so for us, 3/4 of them have contact with the misdemeanor contact, and only a third ever had any felony conviction. For us, 43% were ever incarcerated. That means at least one day. So these could be held. And some of our people, they were held in jail for unpaid fines. Well, they were held in jail for contempt. They had a warrant out for contempt, and then they were brought in, held overnight or more, related to unpaid legal fines and fees. And then we have information about access to legal counsel ever, whether they were represented by a public defender, private attorney, or someone else. So this is the kind of data we have, and then we have more narrative information about each of them. Yeah, go ahead.
Looking at the distributions across these sites,
Yep.
did each of the sites have different approaches for their
recruitment?
recruiting?
Yep.
Like especially the Washington versus Texas,
Yep.
that you just pointed out
Yep.
is really striking.
Yep, and I don't want to make a causal claim here about Washington is so different than Texas. I mean, there are big, important differences. There were some similarities and there were some differences, and so one of the things, I can speak to what we did in Texas, and I'll say also that at the time of this, Washington had only done 9 or 16 interviews. So it was a pretty small sample, and it was largely recruited through networks that they knew, and Alexis has already done a ton of work in Washington, and so it made a lot of sense that the contacts she had were people who had felony convictions, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I don't want to draw too much about that. But in Texas, what we did, and it took us a long time. We were slow because it's big and diverse and all this other stuff. And so what we did was we did outreach to all these organizations, reentry organizations, and other community organizations that worked with people who had contact with the criminal justice system. We posted flyers in a bunch of different locations in the target areas. And then we actually started sitting in court. And we started observing. And we started reaching out to people as they were coming out of court, or coming out of a payment center. And so we actually select, so here's where one of our selection criteria is we ended up getting people who are actually going to try and resolve their issues, right? So that's one of, when we look at payments made, 2/3 of the people we interviewed had tried to make payments. And this is what we did, and we got people to say yes and to do interviews. And one of the things, this relates to something I talked about this morning, which is we also had this big debate about, so do you schedule an interview for a later time, or do you do it on the spot? So, and even within my research team, there were 5 of us who did interviews. There were really 3 of us who did interviews. And one of my students, he really liked to do interviews pretty much on the spot. Say, hey, can you do an interview? And you'd go to a coffee shop or someplace close by. And I didn't like to do that. And so I would always say, let's meet later, or give me your number. We'll set up a time, usually today or tomorrow, within a pretty short window. And when he did that, and somebody, okay, all about tons of room for self-improvement here, tons of room. Okay, people who do this kind of work all the time are probably like, oh my gosh, she is so dumb. So really, this is such an insight. We should have known that. But right? But we're not making any claims about generalization. We're just trying to figure out what's going on. Okay, so I would set these interviews for the next day. And in theory, we always wanted to do that. But in practice, people don't show, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of my students, he's like, 1 no-show, they're out. Right? And I was like, well, and I gave him 3, okay? And so I never had somebody no-show on me 3 times. Never. I didn't do a ton of interviews, but I had 4 guys who were like, and they would text me, I'm on my way. And I'd be sitting, I was in this one coffee shop. They must have just thought, wow, she gets stood up all the time. And I would sit there for hours. And here's the thing, one time, so I had this, one of those burner phones. I didn't even use my smartphone. And so I had my burner phone, and I'm sitting there, I have nothing. I'm sitting, waiting for him to call me back. We're waiting, I'm waiting. It's like an hour and a half. I'm like, okay, he's not gonna come. So then I text him and say, I'm really sorry I missed you. Can we reschedule for tomorrow? Oh yeah, sure. So and then I'd show up again, do it again. And third time was a charm. Every time I had four guys, 2 of them showed up the second time, 2 of them showed up the third time, right? And then I interviewed other people the first time. But the thing that was interesting, and I don't know, it was really instructive for me to understand what stories they told me about why they didn't show, right? And what they had going and how complicated their lives were about why they didn't show. And I gave them 3 shots, and they all came, but that usually was within a week. And here's the thing, if they don't show up for court 1 time, they get a warrant, right? 1 time. And so, it's interesting for me just in this context of just thinking about, okay, how this works. All right, so Texas, we focused on East Texas, West Texas, and Central Texas, and we've been observing, I think we've been to 24 different courtrooms. And what was really important for me, and partly because I was learning the landscape, was I spent a lot of time just sitting in courts and standing outside of courtrooms and trying to get the flow of things. And so I'm going to read just a few excerpts. I think we're good on time. I'd really like to get through them all, but I'm not sure I can. So this is my very first day. And I think it's emblematic of a lot. It's my very first day. My very first day of field notes. It was about 9 months ago, 10 months ago. And I was with one of my graduate students. We went to this suburban municipal court in Central Texas. And so municipal courts are courts where people go to resolve low-level charges, mostly from moving violations. Traffic violations are criminal in the state of Texas. Drug possession, city ordinance violations. I interviewed somebody who had a dog issue. So it was pouring rain that day, Texas-sized rain. So the courtroom was, in everyone's words, unusually slow. At one point, I was the only person in the gallery. There were the judge, the clerk, and 2 uniformed bailiffs were there. And at one point, a man, let's call him John, comes into the courtroom through the metal detector. He's a late middle-aged black man with gray hair cropped close to his head, a sweatshirt, black jeans, glasses, and he wears black high-top tennis shoes. The bailiff asks last name. John states his name. The bailiff asks if he's here for the 10 o'clock docket. John's reply is inaudible to me, but Rosie, the court clerk, says, first come, first served. And John walks out of the back of the courtroom into another room where he'll meet with the prosecutor. So the prosecutor is sitting in a room behind the bench, and apparently people know they need to go there because the bailiff just goes, first come, or in this case, the clerk. I mean, there's a lot of gesturing. Felt like I was a little on a football field. So.
Is that all because they're repeat players, the people churning in, they know the routine?
So here's the thing, they're not. And they're not. And that's actually an observation. That's an observation I had, which is there are people who've never been to court before and they don't have a clue how it works. And the courtroom actors, I'm sure it's familiar to a lot of people, but the courtroom actors, and they don't have attorneys, by and large. And the courtroom actors, it's like an everyday thing to them. And so it's like, it's like your office or, academia. Think about how a first day, first year student feels walking in when you know how it all works and you just go, whoo, first come, first serve. And it's like, the puzzlement on people's faces, it's clear this is not a repeat case. I don't know that for a fact for him, but I'm fairly certain this is not a repeat case. So the clerk says, first come, first serve. He walks out of the back door of the courtroom into another room where he'll meet with the prosecutor. After a very short, so my grad student is in that room. After a very short couple of minutes in which I observe courtroom chatter about another defendant and the weather, John returns to the courtroom through the back door and approaches the judge at the bench. John stands a foot or two away from the bench, stiffly at attention with his hands folded behind his back. The judge asks, what do you want? John says, I'll go for court. The judge questions, do you want pretrial before court or to go straight to a trial? John indicates he wants a trial. The judge says, if you'll have a seat, she'll give you that trial date, and he gestures to Rosie. Rosie says, I'll give it to him right now. John stands between the judge and Rosie, still with his hands behind his back. He says something to them that I can't make out, and Rosie responds, yes, sir, I am. After some idle chatter about the weather, she continues, quote, you'll have options. The judge chimes in, like community service. Okay, there's been no adjudication here. He's going for a trial, and they're already telling him what his potential sentence is. So there's been no adjudication. John continues to talk with the judge and Rosie. It's not clear what the charge is, but it is clear that he doesn't want to pay and he doesn't want to do community service. He gets into a new exchange with the judge in which they're discussing his options. John asks about the possibility of, and I quote, sitting it out in jail, end quote. The judge suggests that John might want to talk to his attorney. He doesn't have an attorney. And then says, quote, you'll only get credit for $50 a day. That's a lot of time, end quote. So he's got a pretty big fine. Rosie interrupts and says, quote, bench trial May 13th, 3 p.m., signature top. The pen's not working. John tells Rosie that the pen's not working, and the police officer standing nearby provides a pen. John confirms the trial is on the 13th. He continues his exchange with the judge and Rosie, seemingly satisfied he's avoided a plea deal and will have his day in court. He directs his final comments to the two uniformed white male police officers standing nearby. He says to them, I don't want to pay any money to a system where the money goes to people like you to shoot people like me. The tension at and around the bench is palpable. The judge and Rosie stiffen. The two uniformed police officers stand alert and say nothing more while John is still in the courtroom. There's no more idle chatter. After signing the papers, John turns to leave down the center aisle. He mumbles to himself on his way out, folding papers. After he's out of the courtroom, a discussion erupts between the judge, the two police officers, and the clerk. They reiterate what he said about not wanting to pay because the money's going back to the guys who are going to kill him. The judge indicates that he thinks he might have some kind of mental illness. The police officers exchange a number of comments, with one of them saying, quote, does he know where his taxes go? End quote, further asking, so is he not going to pay his taxes? Rosie leaves the room for a minute, but when she returns, she revisits the conversation about John. She says, and I quote, he was a very nice man until he started talking, end quote. They continue their conversation about John, and someone reiterates again his claim that the money was going to make it back to you all. They talk about John for a few more minutes, although he's no longer in the room. This was my very first day. And I would like to say that it was exceptional. But now I've done probably 200 plus hours of courtroom observations, and there are examples and examples and examples. And it's not unique, and this is where I want to sort of come back to this question about every city thinks it's unique and thinks it's compassionate and thinks they're doing the right thing, and there are many, many, many examples. So I just want to very briefly, and I'll be more brief on these. So I was in a large eastern city, and we were observing outside of the county courthouse, and it was, this was not my first day, but it was totally overwhelming. And so I actually sought refuge, because there are just hundreds of people coming in and out, hundreds and hundreds of people. I will say this, so we went into the county court complex where people were streaming in and out. It's 10:15 in the morning. I had a water bottle. So maybe this is familiar to all. I had a water bottle. And so we've had to do this before, and I have to take off my shoes. I have to take off my glasses. I don't know how many of you are as dependent on your glasses as I am, but I take off my glasses and I'm absolutely incapable of anything. I can't see anything. I can't see this far. So it's a very discomforting feeling. And so I had a water bottle this time. So in addition, and I think it was new too, because I've had water bottles before. In addition to taking off my shoes and my glasses, I was told I had to take a drink from my water bottle. But like when my glasses are off, I can't hear. And so, so I can't hear. And so I'm going through the metal detector and they're yelling at me, like, take a drink, 3 times at full volume before I make it through the metal detector. And I don't know if there was some sort of a scare. It didn't make it in the newspapers. I don't know where this came from. But I just want to say the level of surveillance was unlike anywhere I'd ever seen. And so all of this added up. I was totally overwhelmed. I went to sit in a municipal court. The judge is late. Courts, and then people come in. I'm going to paraphrase here. They go through everybody. Court ends up starting at 1:02. They go through 14 people, and they're done by 1:16. Okay? 14 people, and that's 14 minutes. Okay, so it's like going through, check. No, I'm not going to tell you. Okay, so, and it's all very methodical. And then the prosecutor, there's this young woman prosecutor, now it's 11, I'm sitting there, and I'm just sitting in the back. I'm the only one left in the courtroom. I'm just kind of waiting to see what they do. There's not another docket until noon. And the prosecutor walks over to me, and she spends 40 minutes with me. I didn't ask her to talk. She wanted to talk to me for 40 minutes. And after 40 minutes of telling me all about her job and her life, so each of the defendants had 1 minute. And I was just sitting in the courtroom, and I got 40 minutes, until I actually said I have to leave. She would have kept talking to me. So that's another example kind of how that justice works. One more, this one, actually I have 2 more, but this one I really want to share. This is a place in East Texas, and I overhear someone saying, I'm sitting in the courtroom, there's a lot of chatter, they're waiting. I overhear someone in the hallway saying, you're late again, Judge. Someone else says, when you get here, that's when it starts. And then I hear the prosecutor say, maybe we won't reset them if they didn't send a note in. And so a 40-something Latino man strides into the room. He's the judge. He looks young. I'd never seen him before. I'd been in this courtroom a few times. He looks young. He has a stylish haircut and an expensive gray suit on. He wears a white button-down shirt with a blue tie. And as he approaches the bench, he starts to remove his suit coat and says, I was stuck in CC1, that's County Court 1. So in this particular location, the judges also work in the county courts. Not as a judge, he was an attorney. I don't know on which side. And And the prosecutor says it'll be quiet today. He sits at the chair at the bench and places his suit coat on the back of the chair while he leans forward. And he looks at the clerk and he says, "How do we start again?" He asks the clerk, prosecutor, attorneys, and the prosecutor says, "You guys are so nice." So they start calling people up. Okay, so they start calling people up. So here, defendant number 3. So defendant number 3 comes up and someone says no officer present. So these are all traffic cases. The officer has to be there. And then someone says no officer present. The judge says dismiss. And then he turns, in this case, in this jurisdiction, there are a lot of defense attorneys for low-level misdemeanors. And he says to the defense attorney, "Good lawyering," right? The cop didn't show up. And he says to the defense attorney, "Good lawyering." Okay, so then they keep going. And the judge says 5, 6, 7. 6 is reset. What about 7? 7, NP, so dismiss. 8, 9, not guilty. 10, not guilty. 11, not guilty. 12, not my case. We'll skip that. 13, 14. Okay, I'm just going to tell you, there's 75 cases on an hour-long docket. 75. So, this is how fast it's going. It's less than 1 a minute. So it continues on for minutes as each case only takes a few seconds. And they go through 25, 27, 27's continued. And so here, the printer starts printing, the judge starts stamping. It feels like a very, machine-like process. And then at one point, there's a long discussion with the prosecutor educating everyone in the room about what's the difference between a dismissal and a not guilty. Because they got in trouble with that once, of marking dismissals as not guilty. And that's really a problem. So we have to make sure, especially when it turns out there's a substitute judge, we can't let this happen. So in this particular case, we go through the whole docket. It's 75 cases. And someone comes in at the end. A man walks into the courtroom. He says he needs to speak to a judge. He asks the bailiff. He says that his attorney told him to come in. And bring his documents to get his case dismissed. He basically wants to have a status hearing, and he wants to have the judge sign off on all his documents and then dismiss the case. He had a deferred adjudication. The bailiff looks confused. He asks the man, "What's your name?" He sits. He's a middle-aged Latino man wearing a t-shirt and jeans. The bailiff goes up to the judge and says, "There's a man who, quote, wants to speak to you." And the judge says, "Sir, yes, sir, come up." He approaches the bench. There's a long discussion about the violation in which a car wasn't registered. The defendant says the car was sold. He traded it in. He got the papers to show the transfer of ownership. "How much did you rack up in tickets?" The judge asked. "Close to $1,000. Do you currently work?" "I'm a military vet." Then they have a discussion about how the defendant is an Army vet. The judge asks the clerk, "Ms. Patton, is there anything I can do for this gentleman?" And the clerk says, "You're not on the docket." The clerk gets involved. The case involves no registration, no insurance. The defendant was advised by his attorney to go to, quote, window 7 or window 8. There are 8 payment windows in this particular courtroom, where he could show his paperwork and have the case dismissed. And the clerk at window 7 or window 8 will advise the judge, and the judge will talk with people. The clerk in the courtroom asked the defendant for his ticket numbers. The clerk then says to the judge, "It depends on what's going on." The clerk says to the defendant, "All you need to do is file your paperwork. You want to write a letter, make a copy." The judge says, "How many are there?" He's asking how many tickets. The clerk says, "Just 2. You didn't have insurance." The judge is looking at everything. The defendant says, "I have everything, but she won't take it," talking about the clerk. The clerk says, in the courtroom, "We don't take that. We need something to show the judge." The guy's got all his paperwork, okay? So he's got all his paperwork. He's trying. The judge asks the clerk some questions. The judge says he's not requesting an indigency hearing. No, the defendant just keeps saying he just wants to explain to the judge because something is getting missed or / lost in translation, conversations with the clerks. He thinks he has all his paperwork he needs, but they seem to indicate he's missing something, though, although he can't tell and I can't tell what it is. But this clerk, like the other, just tells him to turn in what he has. He wants a resolution, and nobody seems to want to give him that. So the clerk says, you're going to have to file the proof that you have. The judge says, "It's going to have to be a judge's call." Sorry, that's what I was trying to get to. And then he realizes he's the judge. He stops. He seems to realize that he's the judge today, and he corrects himself and says, the judge's call, meaning the other judge's call. Okay, so the defendant, clearly frustrated, leaves the courtroom down the center aisle. At the same time, somebody else comes in and is asked to sit down in the front row, to take off his hat before he sits in the front row. The judge and clerk continue to discuss the previous case. The judge says, I guess I was like, I don't want to discuss it. I don't know the backstory. And then the clerk asks if he can sub another day. Okay, so the last one that I wanted to talk about was actually another court in Central Texas where we went on a Tuesday afternoon, and everything we observed, this is post-legislative reform, everything we observed were truancy offenses, and including one in which, so I was stunned. I thought it was going to be something else on the docket. And there's a woman a late middle-aged African-American woman using a blue walker. She's accompanied by a youngish black man, mid-late 20s, I'd guess. And they're later joined by a younger black man in his late teens, I'd guess. They're all dressed casually and in pants or jeans or t-shirts. She indicates that, he indicates, the young man indicates she's the one with the summons, that's the woman. And she says to the clerk, do I need to have Dwayne, my son, here with me? So the child who's being accused of truancy is not there. Other support people are there. So apparently she's appearing on behalf of Dwayne. The clerk comes out from the back room and comes up to her. And this was it was mind-boggling to me. So she comes up to her and she does she gets really, really big. And she's like dressed to the nines, high heels, whole bit. Comes up and leans over this woman and says, once it turns into a warrant, it adds money. So he's 18 now. He's considered an adult. He's jailable. So this was we observed this 6 months ago after legislative reform. Apparently they're not supposed to charge, let alone charge children with truancy. And the clerk is threatening the mom with putting her now 18-year-old son in jail. So those are the data that I'm kind of playing with right now and wrestling over. And I have this nice, I'm not going to play it. So I've been thinking a lot, and particularly about the ways in which what's happening in the courtroom, when I observe now, 80 to 100 different times, only a couple hours at a time, right? It makes sense to me. It's a routine, right? I can see it, right? I'm a sociologist. I look for patterns. But for people who are coming in for the first time, it's not always clear, and there's lots of gesticulating, and it's interesting for me to think about. But I've also been in this one courtroom in West Texas where there was a sub-judge. We watched in a 1-hour session, there were about 70, it's common for them to have 70 people on the docket. We watched them issue 45 warrants for failure to appear, 45. And what happens is they call out the name, they call it out again, and then the judge says warrant. They call out the name. If the person responds, then they mark them as present. If they call it out twice, then the judge, this particular judge, just says warrant. And then he stamps a piece of paper and he turns it over. So I don't know how many of you guys are Pink Floyd fans. So if you listen to the first 30 seconds of the song, Money, that's what it sounds like. It's what it sounds like. Ching, boom, boom, warrant. Ching, boom, boom, warrant. Over and over. And so, it's when that's kind of what I'm trying to wrestle with, and really where, I'm thinking about this so that these key stakeholders in policy discussions in the state of Texas have really emphasized Texas as a model reform state. And yet I think, I mean, I don't know, I'm not super familiar with some of this literature, but I feel like some of these minor interactions, I mean, certainly there's great work that's being done on misdemeanor justice and various dimensions thereof, but it's very hard. Many of the written records actually don't, their experiences aren't legible, especially when they get what is extremely common, which is a deferred adjudication, and they have a supervisory probationary sentence that is then only dismissed upon successful completion, including the payment of legal fines and fees. And so I think that, these are my final insights, so, which you can read. But I guess what I wanted to end with an invitation. And it sort of gets back to this experience of John, which, I mean, it was my very first day, and what I was struck by was the conversation when he wasn't in the room. And I wonder what that conversation would have looked like had he been in the room, to try and understand what is he afraid of, and what, I mean, like if they could talk about what sort of evidence they might have, what his alternatives really were. But I want to have a conversation with everyone in the room about how we can advance justice and conduct more humanizing research that makes everyone visible, accountable, and accounted for. So I'll stop. Take any questions. And
Becky, before you take Q&A, can you just fill in one piece of data?
Yep.
The woman, the prosecutor that comes over to you and she talks for 40 minutes, did she want to impress something upon you? Like she saw you as an outsider in the courtroom and she wanted to, I'm imagining she wanted to tell you something, or was it just mindless chit chat because she was killing time? Or did she want to own a narrative a little bit? Did she know you were a researcher? Yeah, did she know that you're...
She didn't know, so when she came over, she didn't know who I was. She didn't know I was there. She was new, or I don't know that she was new, but it was the first time I had met her. The judge knew the judge knew who I was because I'd sat in his courtroom before. I can tell you what so I don't know what her motivations were, I'm not sure. I think what was sort of striking to me, yeah, I'm sure she wanted to control a narrative. She said she'd be happy to do an interview another time. So I really don't know what her motivations were. She was kind of all over the map, really. There was a lot, she was saying, there's lots of good judges here. She said, I thought long and hard about taking a job here, and I decided I want to work, she said to me. So she really liked the former chief prosecutor in that jurisdiction, and her jury was still out on the new chief prosecutor, who she was working with now. But she, so I don't know why she came to talk to me, but she kept talking.
But she wanted to explain the lay of the land.
Oh, I don't know. Not really. I mean, I don't know. She didn't tell me how it works. I didn't really, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
We can move on. I just thought that was a curious moment where she observed an outsider in the room and wanted to make sure you understood things her way.
Yeah, probably. What's been really interesting to us is, and part of this also just sitting, maybe it's not new to people who've done this courtroom stuff, but what's striking to me is, we've gone into, this is another court in the same jurisdiction. The judge was hostile. You don't want to be here. And they know enough not to say you can't be here. Okay, so they know enough not to say that. And so you don't want to be here, come back. Today's a slow day. What does that mean, a slow day? Oh, I don't know. Total did not want us in the courtroom. And I said, well, I think we're just going to sit. Okay, so we sat. And then an hour later, sitting, and really nothing was happening. It really was a slow day. Not much was happening. She gets out of the bench, she comes down, and she starts chatting us up. So where'd you go to school? Where are you from? So, I don't know what people are trying to do, but I think the irony that I'm trying to pull out here is how highly routinized and how little time they have for people for any one case. And they say, I'm willing to listen to his whole story, and we've seen almost no cases in which a prosecutor has been involved for more than 2 minutes. It is routine. And this is where every courtroom, even if they have court once a month, they schedule it so you get 2 minutes or less. And so I think that was part of what I was trying to draw out there, which is, why do I get 40?
No, I see your point.
Okay. Yeah.
I've been fixated with this, the slide where you had the value distribution for the sanctions by state. So it seems pretty obvious to me that New York's reflecting largely parking tickets. They're the only group that have, huge numbers of $0 to $500 value, and I was wondering is that an excluded population in the other states, or is it just the Manhattan effect, or why is it so New York?
Yeah, so what I would say is that New York, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Brian, or if your interpretation is different. So, I mean, these are not representative. These are the data for the people that we interviewed. And what I would say is that from my understanding is that Texas, Missouri, although they don't have as many misdemeanor cases in here as Beth would like. She wants to do more interviews, actually. Texas, Missouri, California, and New York. The caseload is more misdemeanor cases. I mean, there are people in here who might be able to, all places there's more misdemeanor cases. But so we get these legal fines and fees in those places that, right, it's the scale of the system that we're seeing in some ways, not so much like that it's radically different in New York than other places. So I think it's really the scale of the system. I mean, you're more likely to, on a random draw, find somebody who has a misdemeanor offense in New York than you are to find somebody who has a felony conviction. But it has something to do with the different ways that different places have sampled, or the way that they've drawn. So there's that.
So it's not necessarily reflecting any underlying difference in revenue stream for places.
I would not
New York's
interpret
not
these
one.
data that way, but I do think there are clearly variabilities across states in how significant the legal fines and fees are for revenue generation. And I would argue California, Missouri, New York, and Texas rely on those more heavily for revenue. That's what I think the data show. Not these data, but other data. Yeah, over here and then over here. Yeah.
Where does this money go? What is it used for?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it's generating a huge amount of money. Are people tracking where that's going?
Yeah. Yeah, so in Texas, in Texas there are a couple different streams. So in Texas, all of the justice of the peace and municipal courts essentially give all the money to the state, and then the state gives it back. And in theory, right, it's all the money goes to some dimension of the criminal justice system.
It goes right back into the criminal justice system.
Yeah, in theory. I mean, there's been a lot of legislative reform on this because it wasn't all going back. And so part of and there are very specific, so the way the law developed in the state of Texas was over a long period of time in sort of an incremental fashion, and it brings together a wide range of different actors, and so there's a trauma fee. It's about $2.50 per case, and those dollars go to EMS, right? So those dollars go to EMS. There are other sort of targeted dollars that go to juvenile justice even though it's in an adult system. And so all of the money is supposed to be in Texas, has to be for a specified purpose. There are these very specific bills, line items, where the money goes back. Not in direct proportion, though, to either what motivated, like what the stated rationale is, nor does it go back to jurisdictions in direct proportion to what they give in. So this is why the collections improvement, they call it the collections improvement program. So the collections improvement program is sort of an efficiency gauge of how much you collect on how much is assessed. And so states would get a higher fraction of their collections back if they were more efficient. Now, this was criticized.
Efficiency simply means you got the money that was owed to you?
Yeah, you got 90%. So if you collected over 90% of what was outstanding, you get a higher fraction than if you collect less than 90%, for example. And so, right, without regard for ability to pay. And so the state actually, and these laws were very heavily criticized because they were viewed as increasing the likelihood of coercion. So judges would, be increasingly likely to coerce people to pay and not pay attention to ability to pay, because their budgets are the amount they got back from the state, so it would rely on that. So that's the justice in the municipal system in Texas. The felony system in Texas is such that people get assessments at the time of sentencing. Felonies in the state of Texas, it's all mandated 1 year of jail time. But you get credit for time served. And so upon release from state jail or prison, you're typically the balance, unless you had a massive restitution, it'll be zero. But then what happens is people who are on probation or parole, they then essentially restart. So they get charged monthly supervision fees. They get charged service fees for any program they might be involved in. They get charged for lots of different things. That money stays entirely within probation. So probation departments are funded between 30 and 60% of probation budgets are covered exclusively by locally collected fines and fees.
So it's a real perverse incentive system there.
Right. So there's no central. So Texas, I would say, is an extreme case. And people have made the argument it's a revenue generating mechanism. So, but that's how it works in Texas.
So I have two questions related to I guess they're more comments related to your ethnographic data.
Yeah.
And one, with the field notes that you were reading, I felt like you got a little bit of a sense of the race and ethnicity of a couple of the folks in the room. But I'm wondering, assume the other people are all white?
Right.
It sounds like the bailiffs were white, so yes.
No, so they're not all white.
Okay.
And so usually at I wondered about that, and I thought, how much so in my field notes somewhere, I talk about the race and ethnicity, or from my view, right? So I don't ask them. I mean, I'm not asking them. So, but I typically try and record it for everyone.
Okay.
And so what I would say, so I try to record it for everyone. That didn't come across.
But no, I was just curious. And
Yeah.
the second point was, I know you're probably still catching up to speed on some of the ethnographic literature on courtroom interactions and whatnot. But if you're familiar with Sally Mary's Getting Justice, Getting Even, it's kind of an oldie but goodie.
Yeah.
It's like 1990. But it seems like some of the data you're collecting could shape into kind of an interesting criminal case analog to the small claims court interactions that she's observed, in the way that these kind of petty moral cases in her research were discarded pretty rapidly, and depending on who brought them and what they were arguing. And it sounds like it would be an interesting criminal analog to who's bringing the case, what type of case, and how they're just, it's an illusion of justice that you're talking about, and how they're discarded pretty rapidly and very methodically and shoved over into different windows and whatnot.
Right.
Just an interesting.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you for that suggestion. Yeah.
Sort of picking up on Lee's point, the work also reminds me of Malcolm Feely's work, The Processes of Punishment.
Yeah.
And some of the early work that was also done by political scientists around the courtroom work group. That, these, and you might look at Jeff Ward, our colleagues, because he, it's an article in Law and Society Review where they vary, picking up also on Lee's point, where they vary they look at the impact of the race of various players. It's based on federal courts, but it might give you some insight. So I was wondering whether, how, if you kind of think of that as a foil against which to think about what you're finding, is it a repeat of the same thing, or is it a new story? And if so,
No. Yeah. Well, it doesn't feel like a new story to me, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to get an angle on.
It seems to me, if you think about Doc Feely's work, the process was the punishment, and then most of the cases are dismissed.
Right.
So it's the time they serve in jail while they're waiting to be tried that then it's time served. So it seems to me, this may be a more punitive system that you're describing, to the extent that may be something to pick up on, the extent to which people are still punished in some way as a result of, as an outcome measure, rather than as a retrospective activity that, I don't know, just something to play around with.
No, I mean, those are great suggestions and ideas, and there are a bunch of things. One, I have this graduate student whose name is Ilya Slavinsky, and he's actually, one of the sort of related to Jeff's work, is he's doing some work specifically looking at sort of kind of how bureaucratization and professionalization in the workplace, right, leads people. I mean, some of these things are really efficient. I mean, hey, if you can do 75 cases in less than an hour, right? I mean, you know, on an efficiency metric, it's pretty amazing. And the other thing is that one of the things he's also observing is how sort of these normalized sort of office politics stuff happen in the context of, I would say, pretty weighty decisions. So he was actually observing in a district court.
State district.
Yeah, state district court in which, right, so these are all felony cases. So Texas State District Court. Felony cases, all of which are going to carry with them a jail sentence of at least a year. So in the middle of this, there's a birthday party, a cake, balloons, right? It's like kind of break between cases. Let's have cake. I mean, the guys are sitting in there. I mean, and they're all guys at this particular session. They're all guys still in their prison, you know, stripes in there, and while the judge, the prosecutor, the clerk, and a few other people have cake. Ice cream, cake, balloons, candles. So, I mean, that, you know, and it's sort of like, so he's thinking a lot about, you know, how do you do, you know, these workplace, like these norms of a, you know, a modern workplace, and in the context of this, this thing. So he's thinking a lot about that. In terms of sort of speaking to Malcolm Feely's work, I ask myself this question a lot, which is, what do I say that hasn't already been said, right? And so part of the thing that, you know, I sort of wrestled with, like, okay, is this just Malcolm? I mean, and I'm not the only person who's doing this kind of work, but, you know, is this just like, oh, in 2018, here it is, the process is the punishment, right? Or, and I think that's partly why I tried to hook it the way that I did, which is like, this is a model reform state. It's a model reform state.
Do you really believe Texas is, I mean, that's the first I'd heard of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'm so, no, I mean, like, look at the Brennan Center, like, DC, like, all these places, like.
Because do most people think Texas is the model?
Maybe not here, not among.
They're being right on crime.
Right on crime, I mean, smart on crime. I mean, the rhetoric is all over the place. And that's where, like, I was stunned when Mary Patillo sent me this email saying, like, Texas is the model reform. And I'm like, yeah, the judge has said some smart things. He has. He's said some really smart things. But the judiciary actually he has no control over the judiciary. And so the judiciary hasn't made, I mean, okay, maybe with a few exceptions, and maybe my glass is half empty on this, but when we observe these places, you know, it's sort of, I feel like there's this expose. Why aren't we talking about this? And one thing, and then I'll take your question, which is, so we had this group meeting. What was it? It was in October. And we were talking about how to, we were talking about how to record our field notes. And I was, you know, this is how I do it. I just sort of am kind of been being educated by some of my colleagues who just say, write it all down and figure out what it means later. Just write it all down. And so I was recounting one of these incredibly dehumanizing experiences and just observing how dehumanizing some of the courtrooms are, most of them. And I don't know if you remember this, but I got a pat on the head from one of my colleagues who I adore in many, many ways, and saying, oh, Becky, you're just realizing, like, you've got to figure out what it really means. Okay, so get over the experience and now figure out what it really means. But I'm like, but that is what it really means, isn't it? I mean, at some level, like, so for me, that's part of it, which is, like, so there sort of is this that, you know, how can I build on what's already been done? And I think there's a couple things that still surprise me, even knowing what I know, still surprise me. And I think the other thing, as a demographer, I'm just blown away by the scale. And to imagine that somehow this is normalized, that you see 7 million cases in a single state. I know it's a big state, but it's not as big as your state. And, you know, that sort of at some level, it's like, okay, maybe we just need to say it again.
No, I think it needs to be, I think that's important. I didn't mean to.
No, I don't,
But it would be interesting, I think, to go back. I mean, I haven't looked at processes of punishment in a long time, but to the extent that he makes this, as I recall, this emphasis that, you know, it is the process.
Right.
You know, it may be that process is no longer only it's part of the punishment, but it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
And maybe through the interviews to trace out some of the collateral consequences of the lived experience. You know, some of the things like our former colleague Sarah Wakefield looks at, or the family consequences and so forth. That really does kind of extend the trajectory.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I appreciate that. And Malcolm Feely is like here all the time. The shadow is casting. You had a question?
Yeah, sorry. No, quick one. When you were talking about Texas as this major example, and I was just wondering if this was another case of like the prejudice of low expectations, that if Texas does anything that seems even vaguely progressive, it gets way too much credit for it.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that's been really interesting to me is sort of think about, like, so there are a couple of things that Texas has done really well, and I would question the motivations, right? So Texas radically reformed the juvenile justice system in 2007 because there were egregious cases of abuse. There was also the threat of federal oversight. And if there's anything Texans don't want, is they don't want the feds involved. And so I would argue, I don't have any evidence to back this up, so I'm just saying it. But I would argue that some of the very careful consideration of fines and fees and the active discussion in the legislature was because there were some very egregious, there still are, very egregious cases of, people being held in jail solely for their inability to pay. And there was no determination of ability to pay, and there was also no determination of willfulness, right? And so they would come in and people, in a number of different jurisdictions. And so I think that the chief judge was smart because the feds were, this is right after Ferguson, the feds they're hovering in Texas. They want a Texas case. That landscape has changed, I would say, fairly dramatically in the last year. But so I think that there's a lot of pressure in Texas to have this rhetorical conversation, or to have this conversation. And so I think part of what I guess I'm seeing my task a little bit is, okay, so what do the data actually show? And it's been hard, and we're trying to get individual case level data. Some of that's more available than other places. Your colleague Emily knows a lot about, San Antonio or Bexar County. But that's something that we're also trying to do, just to get some purchase on this. But I do think, and I do think, like, at some level, this idea, like the fiscal responsibility reform thing, that goes a long way. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, prisons aren't necessarily the most fiscally responsible investment. I don't know how to put it, but and so there's a lot of, there's a way to sort of think about how you can leverage that, and I get that politically, but in terms of empirically, I'm struggling with that. So.
One last question.
Nobody else. You said you saw 45 warrants issued.
In one
chunk.
Yep.
How often were you seeing people appearing in court due to failure to appear? Those would be arrests that weren't showing up in your. So, how much of the motivation behind this might be the relative return on investment between court appearance and fine versus the costs of incarceration being absorbed by the state at the outset?
Right.
Because if they're not incarcerating a large proportion of the warranted failure to appear population, I'm assuming the failure to appears carry a higher fine or an additional fine on top of it that is in addition to any of it? Oh, okay. So it's not as though it's a double-sided revenue effect where they're not only avoiding the cost of incarceration, but they're exacerbating the fines at the same time.
Yeah, okay, so in some jurisdictions, they do charge a $50 warrant fee, and then you're responsible for that $50 warrant fee. So if a warrant is issued for your arrest due to failure to appear, that adds a tax of $50 on. That's not universal across the state of Texas. That would, of course, be a perverse incentive. But we don't see many of those, but we have seen a few. And what we have observed judges do when someone appears after a warrant when someone appears in court, right? So it's a whole different matter when they get picked up, okay? But when somebody just comes to court and they had failed to appear and that shows up, what we've seen judges effectively do is strike it, or strike the failure to appear, and essentially give them a continuance. That's what I mean. We've seen maybe a dozen of those, maybe less, but in that ballpark, and that's what we've seen probably 3 different judges do. Now, I don't know that that's a super common thing. The other thing I want to say is we've just seen these like courts in session, somebody shows up, right? Okay, so, and that happens in some jurisdictions more than others, but Texas has this whole, different jurisdictions also have what they call the Warrant Roundup. So people during that window, which is actually, my understanding is they're not supposed to do that this year. We'll see what happens. But there's a month-long window. It's about tax return time, usually happens in about March, where you essentially have amnesty from arrest or jail if you show up to resolve an outstanding warrant for failure to appear and outstanding fines and fees.
Please come pay us without us having to pay somebody to go get you.
Yeah, well, so that, it sounds cynical, but it actually isn't. In Austin, the city where I live, there are these banners that are all over the city, and it says this was last year in March, Warrant Roundup Month, or Warrant Roundup Month. And so you can go in, and it's like an amnesty program, they call it. Anyway, so we haven't observed during that time, and I think it would be interesting to see during that time what actually happens. But just on a regular basis, it doesn't happen very often. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was so helpful.